So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Introduction to Cultural Studies, where we're looking at Ian Hacking's The Social Construction of What, the book that we're studying at the moment. And this will be the last lecture on that particular book. So we started in the previous lecture with the subsection called Interactions, and we just began with that section, and then we move on with this and hopefully conclude the book for our purpose in this lecture. So we saw interactions become a very important activity for hacking. So it looks at interactions as happening within certain matrices of production, how interactions produce human subjects, how interactions produce agreements, decisions, consensus, disagreements, etc. And we saw some time ago when we were looking at the introduction that Hacking is writing that he's more in favor of using the word social product than social construction, because he's more interested in the production that happens through material conditions, right, rather than construction. So construction becomes a very loose category, a very nebulous category for hacking, and he is more keen on looking at the materiality of that particular production of human subjects and the subjects' situatedness in the same. Okay, so and then this is the point, this is a section where Hacking talks about how all our acts are under descriptions, and the acts that are open to us depend in a purely formal way on the descriptions available to us. Moreover, classifications do not exist only in the empty space of language, but in institutions, practices, material interactions with things and other people. So the difference that is making between the empty space of language and the materiality of institutions, that holds the key for our understanding of what Hacking is saying. So the empty space of language is where Hacking says that's where the purely social constructionist theory operates. It's purely rhetorical, it's purely an empty space of language. It becomes a loose linguistic activity compared to the solid materiality, the ontological materiality of institutions, practices, and material interactions. So this particular bit, we need to understand this very clearly in terms of looking at what Hacking is favoring for and what he resists, what he rejects as a theory. So the empty space of language is purely rhetorical in quality, is purely loose in quality, and Hacking seems to reject that in principle and is more in favor of the institutions, practices, and material interactions with things and other people. So it becomes an intersubjective, interactional activity to very material conditions, and in that materiality is meaning produced. Okay, the woman refugee, the kind of species of person, or not the person, is not only a kind of person, it's a legal entity, and more importantly, a paralegal one used by boards, schools, social workers, activists, and refugees. So the woman refugee, that's one of the categories that Hacking keeps referring to. The woman refugee doesn't become just a social constructionist saying, but a real legal entity. A paralegal one used in school textbooks, boards, social workers, activists, and refugees. So it becomes, the woman refugee becomes a real condition, a real identity, and not just a loosely, rhetorically constructed social identity. Okay, so only within such a matrix could there be serious interaction between the kind of person and people who may be of that kind. So again, the matrix quality is something that Hacking is very, very keen on, and he said it's only within the materiality of the matrix can we have any sophisticated or appropriate understanding of the woman refugee as a legal, political, immigration, racial category. So all these things come into play, and there are material institutions at work over here. There are material texts at work over here. The people, the real people at work over here. There are material apparatus at work over here. There are real laws which are at work over here, and all these different materiality, different orders of materiality need to be brought together in order to understand or substantiate or highlight the woman refugee condition, and instead of looking at it as a purely constructionist perspective. Okay, so interactions do not just happen, they happen within matrices, which include many obvious social elements and many obvious material ones. So interactions don't happen in empty space, they don't happen in loose linguistic activities, they happen within matrices which include economy, institutions, law, legality, codes, medical practices, rituals, etc. So all that become the matrix inside which interactions take place, and subject positions are created or generated or agreed upon from these interactions. Again, in the last lecture we saw how Hacking has very usefully given us an entanglement between ontological subjectivity and epistemological objectivity. And he gives a very banal example of house rent, as an example. So the house rent has to be agreed upon by 2 or more people, and that agreement is subjective in quality. It has to be, subjectively decided upon. It is an intersubjective agreement in a way. But once that agreement is reached, then a knowledge about the house rent becomes an objective category, so it becomes epistemologically objective. So this loop between ontological subjectivity and epistemological objectivity is something that Hacking keeps referring to throughout this particular book. And that's a similar loop functions, many more complex loops like that function within the matrices that Hacking highlights over here. Okay, so they happen within matrices which include many obvious social elements and many obvious material ones. So the social and material are constantly entangled with each other. So just to branch out and say that everything is a social construct often becomes a very gross disregard, according to Hacking, of the real material conditions, the real material dimensions of that matrix in which the subject is situated. Nevertheless, a first and simplistic observation seems uncontroversial. It stems from the almost too boring to state fact that people are aware of what is said about them, thought about them, done to them. They think about and conceptualize themselves. Inanimate things are, by definition, not aware of themselves in the same way. Take the extremes: women refugees and quarks. So, quarks are inanimate activities. Women refugees are, real human people who are oftentimes in crisis, who experience, suffering, loss of agency, etc. So, there's an extreme example that Hacking is offering over here. A woman refugee may learn that she is a certain kind of person and act accordingly. Quarks do not learn that they are a certain kind of entity and act accordingly. But I do not want to overemphasize the awareness of an individual. Women refugees who do not speak one word of English may still, as part of a group, acquire the characteristics of women refugees precisely because they are so classified. Right, so classification takes place inside material conditions, inside matrices, and obviously awareness of yourself inside a matrix make you an animate person, an animate human being, a human being with a degree of articulation and agency, that you're aware of your location, of your situatedness as a subject inside a particular matrix, right, or the matrices that you inhabit at a certain point of time. Okay, so the woman refugee as a kind of classification can be called an interactive kind because it interacts with things of that kind, namely people, including individual women refugees who can become aware of how they're classified and modify their behavior accordingly. So notice how Hacking over here is sort of very sophisticatedly moving towards this entanglement between interiority and exteriority. So what you are as a person, how you behave as a person, is determined by your interactions with other persons at a given point of time inside a particular matrix, right? So, and that particular matrix is also a classifying matrix. It classifies you as a category. So the woman refugee can be called an interactive kind because it interacts with other things of that kind. So it interacts with other human refugees, other people, and through that interaction, they can generate a degree of awareness, who can become aware of how they're classified and modify the behavior accordingly. Quarks, in contrast, do not form an interactive kind. The idea of the quark does not interact with quarks. Quarks are not aware that they are quarks and are not altered simply by being classified as quarks. There are plenty of questions about this distinction, but it's basic. So again, it's a very basic, banal description that or distinction that Hacking is offering over here. Some version of it forms the fundamental difference between the natural and the social sciences. The classifications of the social sciences are interactive. The classifications and concepts of the natural sciences are not. So again, there is a ontological difference between the classifications of natural sciences and social sciences, and that difference lies in interactivity. So the social sciences classifications are more interactive, they interact with each other, classifications, whereas in contrast with other classifications, the natural sciences do not interact with each other. Okay? In the social sciences, there are conscious interactions between kind and person. There are no interactions of the same type in the natural sciences. It is not surprising that the way in which constructionist issues arise in the natural sciences differ from questions about construction in human affairs. I shall now pose 2 separate groups of questions, those involving contingency, metaphysics, and stability, and issues that are biological but still of the interactive kind. So We not go into this, but suffice it to say that what hacking is saying over here is there are questions of contingency, metaphysics, and stability, and issues that are biological but interactive. So interaction becomes a very important issue over here. And interactional activity, biology, agency, these become very important categories for hacking, especially when you consider the subject's position inside a particular matrix. Material matrix, which combine materiality with abstraction, materiality with emotions, etc. So the material conditioning becomes a very key conditioning for hacking, and the way he examines this. Okay, so we just wind up with this, and the last bit of the introduction is something that we pay some attention to. So the last bit, the final paragraph of the introduction, is something that a place where we should spend some time on in terms of wrapping up the arguments that hacking had used so far. Looping effects are everywhere. So by looping effects, hacking means, again, the interaction between the inside and the outside, what you are as a person inside and how you interact with the environment outside. And they form a loop with each other. They both inform each other, they feed off each other. This kind of an interaction between the inside and the outside, between the interiority and external world, between the psychological inwardness, the existential inwardness of the subject, and the extended socialness of the subject. They are looping at every given point of time, so they form a looping effect constantly. So think what the category of genius did to those romantics who saw themselves as geniuses, and what their behavior did in terms to the category of genius itself. So it's mentioning the romantics, the romantic poets, the romantic painters, the romantic writers in Britain and British literature at that point of time. So the category of genius, so the classification of genius, the social classification of genius. So what that did to the romantics who saw themselves as geniuses, who considered themselves as geniuses, so they interacted with the classification of genius, and what that behavior did, that particular behavior did in turn to the category of genius itself. So the interaction produced a new category of genius. So it's a loop. So first of all, the human subject interacts with the classification outside, and that interaction alters the classification subsequently. So it's a very interesting interactional activity that hacking is highlighting. And of course, this activity takes place inside a material condition, inside a matrix, which should not be seen loosely just as a social constructionist thing, right? It's an extreme material thing. It takes into account various factors such as economy, law, language, race, and political conditions, etc. And so these become very important categories in that particular section. Think about the transformations affected by the notions of fat, overweight, anorexic. So, we saw how hacking spends some time with anorexia, how anorexia becomes a very important category for hacking. And, he moves away from a purely social constructionist understanding of anorexia into more complex and more sophisticated understanding of anorexia. If someone talks about the social construction of genius or anorexia, they are likely talking about the idea, the individuals falling under the idea, the interaction between the idea and the people, and the manifold of social practices and institutions that these interactions involve, the matrix in short. Okay, so this concludes the introduction to the social construction of what, but it's a very useful and provocative book in some sense, because it differs from a trendy way to analyze and examine cultural categories. So it moves away from the trend, it moves away from the fashionable way of looking at social categories and subcategories, and it ends with a very useful piece of useful sentence, which is basically a revelation, where he says that when people talk about ideas, when people talk about certain categories like genius or anorexia, they're talking about the idea, and by extension the individuals falling under the idea, and by extension the interaction between the idea and the people, and the way the people interact with the idea, and the manifold of social practices and the rituals and institutions that those interactions involve. So for instance, if it's anorexia, then the rituals, institutions will become medical, will become legal, will become popular, will become the media, etc. So these become the apparatus when it comes to looking at anorexia as a condition. Similarly, when it comes to genius as a condition, and the way the interactions between people and the idea happen, will include institutions such as literature, literary reviews, books, institutions, academic circles, critical circles, cultural circles, political circles, etc., political rewards, prizes, etc. So these become very important in that particular international activity. So these become involved in any interaction between the people and the idea in that kind of a setting. So in other words, what becomes involved, what happens is a matrix, right? So the matrix becomes important for hacking, and the matrix becomes a more complex category than construction. So construction is a very loose category, which oftentimes, according to hacking's analysis, ends up being a loose linguistic activity, a loose rhetorical activity, and a moves away from the sophistication and complexity of the cultural categories that hacking is trying to highlight over here. So rather than looking at construction as an epistemic tool or an epistemic category, hacking is more interested in looking at the matrix as an epistemic category, as an epistemic tool, because the matrix involves incorporates a materiality, it incorporates institutions, it incorporates different forms of interpolation, different forms of institutionalization, different forms of materiality, and that becomes more useful, a more holistic, a more complex category through which social and cultural categories and subcategories can be examined according to Hacking's analysis. So with that, we conclude the social construction of what. We just read the introduction in great detail. That's because that sets out the pattern for the book, that sets out the agreements, the arguments that Hacking will use subsequently in this particular book. But just to summarize and just to sort of quickly connect this book to some of the other texts that we have done so far. It's a very important book in cultural studies because it makes us aware not to go too much, not to be seduced too much by the entire constructionist discourse, which says everything is a construct, everything is a social construct, so there's nothing beyond the construct, etc. That kind of a loose understanding of society, that kind of a loose understanding of culture or cultural materiality often does a disservice to the real lived reality of culture, to the real lived reality of the human subject inside a particular cultural condition. So this book is a reminder to resist and reject that kind of a loose seduction into a linguistic play, into a rhetorical play of constructionism, and rather bring awareness back to the more material conditions, the more complex conditions of discursivity, materiality, and abstraction, which is constantly at play. The entanglement is constantly at play in terms of how the human subject is situated, resituated, and desituated in culture. And again, production becomes a very important idea in Hacking's analysis. So as we mentioned at the very beginning of this course, production is a very important term, a very important category, a very important activity in cultural studies, not least because production can be discursive in quality, production can be material in quality, production can be a combination of discursivity and materiality. And of course, production can be linguistic, production can be ideological, etc. So rather than looking at construction as a category, Hacking is more interested in looking at production as a category, and it maps out the ontological differences, the functional differences between production and and construction, because production entails materiality, production entails an awareness of materiality, incorporation of materiality, which sometimes construction does away with. Right, so construction, a loose constructionist theory can sometimes disregard the materiality of that entire system and just become an empty language activity, an empty linguistic activity, an empty rhetorical activity that Hacking warns us against. So this particular book, The Social Construction of What, is a very useful reminder for us in cultural studies not to be sort of too narrowed down by the social constructionist perspective, but rather look at the entire process of culture and cultural production as a material activity which brings into effect ideology, abstraction, ideas, real conditions and lived reality in a very useful entanglement, and that's what constitutes culture and cultural practices. So with that, we conclude this book, The Social Construction of What by Ian Hacking. Thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to a new text in the following lectures. Thank you.